little breezeway between each building, the best I remember it. Isn't that right, Bob? Shirky. Yeah, here was the building and you came out the front door and you went down this walkway, which I just said, like a tunnel. You could see from one end to the other, but all these separate buildings which were different wings of the hospital. Question. This was the infirmary where you took the airmen, right? Dennis. There were some ramps there. I think the old ramp's still there. It was. Anyway, that's the kind of buildings they were. You don't see it today, no. Question. I knew that the building, most of it, was new, but I wasn't sure if they built onto it. Dennis. That had been worked over 2 or 3 times. Question. When you look at it, it looks like it's been one of these things where they've added things to it. So you pulled around behind the infirmary, basically. Dennis. It was a pretty tight squeeze in there. You couldn't get very many cars in there. Question. How many of those ambulances were back there? Dennis. There were 3 old box ambulances. I call them box ambulance. I guess you call them. I wasn't in the military, so I don't know what all the terms were. Question. Like these old field ambulances? Dennis. They've got the old square field ambulances, you know. Question. The airman walked up that ramp with you. Both of you guys went into... Dennis. The airman and I both went in. Question. Did he see that stuff in... Dennis. He wasn't paying any attention because I had a tourniquet and towel over his busted nose and he went right on in. Question. Got himself into a little trouble in town, did he? Dennis. Rode an old motorcycle. The reason I remember it is because he had an old Indian motorcycle and I just bought one. I paid $40 for one and he rode one and I didn't have any fenders. And I was thinking of Question. So you took him in there and then basically after you got him taken care of, you figured you'd go look up your friend, the nurse. Let's get that straight. Dennis. Stan Friedman, I think. Somebody thought that I was having a relationship with this nurse. I was not. This girl wouldn't even think about going with me, and she was going strictly. When she got her time paid back to the service, she was going into an order of the nuns, sisters, and she was going to be in education, and later on she changed to the nursing deal. The only reason she was in it, because her folks were in debt, and she went into service to get her education. She got her education, and then she was going to pay back the church what they owed her. Her whole thing in life was, from the day she was born, her life was planned that she was going to be in an order. Question. Did she ever tell you which order that was? Dennis. It was in St. Paul, Minnesota. That's all I know. Question. That's where she was from? Dennis. That's where she was born and raised. She never went out of the city until she went to... My understanding was she never went anywhere and she never lived anywhere. She was raised up from the time, strictly raised by the church. That was the only life she ever planned. She wouldn't date a man if her life depended on it. She'd get around and talk and everything, but there was no way. But everybody said I was going to marry her, and that's bullshit. Question. The implication was that she was cute and... Dennis. She was cute. I could have been interested. If I wouldn't have played second fiddle to the Catholic Church, because that's what she would have been. Question. How did you get to know her? Just being out there on the base? Dennis. The ambulance service. You go out there and you've got your splints on a guy, you've got first aid, whatever. You can't just throw them off your stretcher. You maybe help them. Sometimes you're out there 2 hours or 3. Then while you're waiting to get your equipment back, you sit in the coat room with the doctors and with the nurses' quarters. That's where we always had our coats and stuff. Question. So you just shoot the breeze with whoever's around? Dennis. You get to know these people. That's the only way. See, she'd only been there less than 3 months. Of course, I'm a crazy son of a gun. Nearly everybody remembered her. She was a good-looking little thing, a beautiful little girl. We thought she was kind of lonely. Question. As you well know, there's been a major effort to try to find her. Skip intake. Dennis. She was out here less than 3 months. Question. So you went back there. Tell me what happened. Dennis. I started back there, and that's when I got in trouble. I saw this officer standing there, and I saw this debris in the back of the ambulance. 2 of them was full of debris. Like Bob Shirky saw a bunch of little stuff, and there was a couple of pretty good sized. Question. 2 of the 3 ambulances had stuff. Dennis. One of them's door was closed, but the other 2, there was 2 MPs standing right out, kind of just leaning up against the back of those, I remember. Question. Did they challenge you when you tried to go in? Dennis. No, evidently because I drove up with that airman and they just figured whatever. Another thing, when I was there, all the people that was there, that nurse was the only person I saw that was permanent station. Everybody else was all new in that whole hospital operation. Even in the coke room, there wasn't anybody in there that I knew. I started back and got to the door, and I saw this. Pause. We've been friends for years, but I don't want to talk with him around. Question. So the stuff you saw, you said it was not aluminum. Dennis. Looked like hot stainless steel when it got hot. When you put flame on stainless, see? I do sculpture work and all that, and I know what the stuff looks like. Question. Oh, you're a sculptor? I didn't know that. Dennis. Yeah, I've been doing it for years. I had my own foundry. I did. I don't do it any. This stuff was a blue purplish. It looked like hot stainless steel, is what it looked like. Steel that got hot. It didn't look like aluminum. It wasn't even melted like aluminum. I don't even think it was melted, just like a bunch of fragments. Question. But there were some bigger things in there besides the fragments, right? Dennis. Yeah, there was 2 pieces. Anyway, you want to go back to the nurse? Question. Yes, please. Dennis. I started back, see, and this captain was standing there, and naturally, I just thought we had a plane crash. When we had that, we used to fill up the ambulances and everything else. It would, inaudible, for you to have a hand here, or an arm, or a foot, or something. You know what I'm talking about. Then you've got to get in and take all that stuff and separate it and put those bodies back together with identification. That's what you've got to do. I thought we had a crash. I saw this guy. I didn't know him. He was standing there at the door. Question. Just inside? Dennis. Just kind of standing like in between the door of this room up there. I was going down the hall. I said, Sir, it looks like we had a plane crash. Do I need to go in and get ready for it? Question. This was an officer? Dennis. Yeah, he was a captain. I remember the bars on his inaudible. He said, Who are you? I told him I was from the funeral home, and he said, Wait right here, don't move. Then he came back. That's when the 2 MPs came up. When the nurse came out, we started down the hall, and that's when somebody in the back of us said, Bring that son of a bitch back. That's when the red-headed captain asked where the sergeant came in right there. Then they took me on out. As I was going down the hall, she came out of, like Bob said, out of this room, and there was 2 guys in back of her, and they all had towels over their face. She saw me and she said, Glenn, what are you doing here? Get out of here. You're going to get in a lot of trouble. How did you get in here? She said that 2 or 3 times. She was sick. Question. This is when you were talking to that first officer? Dennis. Yeah. He just told the MPs to take me back to the funeral home. Question. He had just told them that, and then she appeared at that point? Dennis. He told them to take me to the funeral home, and we started down the hall, back out the hall, and that's when she came out of another room with these other 2 guys. What happened, she told me the next day, they were all sick because those little bodies were in those sacks, and 2 of them were very mangled, and the smell was horrible, and one was whole, and 2 of them were very badly mangled. Question. Did you get a whiff of that stuff yourself? Dennis. No, evidently not. If I would have known what it was. I worked on a hell of a lot of stuff. Question. In that tape you talked about working on floaters and all that kind of stuff. Dennis. You know? Question. I haven't had professional experience in it, but I've been involved in it. Dennis. In New Mexico, you've got this hot 100-degree stuff, and you've got bodies out there 2 or 3 days, and inaudible. Question. This red-headed guy, what was his rank? Do you remember? Dennis. I think he was a captain. It seemed to me like he had on some bars. Question. When he first appeared and started getting, essentially, pretty rough, was the sergeant around at that time, or did he show up? Dennis. He was kind of beside him. I think they were standing there. Yeah, they were definitely standing there together. I don't know if they walked in together, because I didn't see them until they turned me around. Question. Was there a lot of activity at that time? Were there people? Dennis. People were everywhere, and the odd part of it was there wasn't anybody. Wasn't any of our regular people. These were all people that I'd never seen before. That's why I got in so much trouble. I'd never seen these guys. Question. These were not any of the guys that would ordinarily recognize you as somebody who would. Dennis. And they sure as hell didn't want me there. You know that. Question. When he says, get him out of there, the redhead, did he make any threats to you himself? Did he say, don't say anything about this, forget it? Dennis. He said, just like that. He says, now listen, mister, you don't go back into town starting a bunch of damn rumors. This guy swore as much as I do. Anyway, he said, don't start a bunch of damn rumors because nothing happened out here. There's no plane crashes, nothing's happened. You don't go in and start. Then he told the MPs, get the son of a bitch out of here. That's when I said, right then, I said, look, mister, I'm a civilian and you can't do a damn thing to me. You go to hell. That's when he said, listen, mister, somebody will be picking your bones out of the sand. Then the black sergeant said, sir, he would make good dog food, or something like that. I remember the dog food. The next morning at 6 o'clock, the sheriff was out at my dad's house and told my dad, Glenn may be in a lot of trouble with the base, and tell him to keep his mouth shut. I never told my story to anybody, but my dad came up. I was living in a room at the funeral home. He came up and got me out of bed and wanted to know what I'd done. He was a very patriotic old man, and he said, if you've done anything against our government, I'll take care of it. Question. When was this? Dennis. The next morning. Question. You were saying what the heck? What's going on? Dennis. Yeah. I said, well, hey, he said, George Wilcox, the sheriff, and my dad were real good friends. And he said, George tells me you're in a lot of trouble out there. He wasn't going to leave, and I told my dad the story. He got all upset because they threatened me and all this kind of stuff. I didn't see the nurse then until the next day. After I saw her, then I kept calling. When I got back to the funeral home, I started calling because she was in trouble and so was I. Question. It was the next morning after you'd been hustled out of there that your dad came by to see you. Dennis. Yeah, 6 o'clock in the morning. Question. You'd been called by the sheriff. Dennis. The sheriff went to my mother and dad's house, and at 6 o'clock, my dad always got up early, sat and had coffee. He was an old carpenter and building contractor. He and George were always making gun stocks, so they were good friends. They used to play some kind of domino games or 42, whatever you call it. They were good friends. Question. So the sheriff went by to see your dad. Dennis. Dad said he was there at 6 o'clock. Question. The sheriff came by early in the morning, and then your dad immediately came from home and came to see you. Dennis. After George Wilcox left, my dad came up to the funeral home and wanted to know what I did. Question. Did your dad say why the sheriff? Had the sheriff been contacted by the base, or